In a sunlit park where peace should have reigned, a starving young black boy offered his only food to an elderly woman in a wheelchair. But just as kindness bloomed between them, a police officer struck the boy in the head with a metal baton. Why? Because of his skin color. What the world didn't see coming was who that woman really was, and how her next move would rewrite everything. This is a story of injustice, heartbreak, and one unimaginable twist that turned brutality into blessing. Location: Greenpoint Public Park, Missouri. Time: 1:23 p.m. Thursday. He gave food. He gave compassion. Then he was struck down, but the woman he fed had more power than anyone knew. The park was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, sending little ripples through the branches above. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs blending with the quiet laughter of children playing near the swings. The scent of warm earth and freshly mowed grass drifted through the air. 10-year-old Deshaun sat on the edge of a bench, his legs dangling, one shoelace dragging against the ground. He wore a ripped polo shirt that was 2 sizes too big, and a pair of dusty sneakers that had seen better days. In his hands, he clutched a slice of pepperoni pizza, wrapped in a crumpled napkin. It was his favorite kind, and he had been saving it all afternoon, knowing he might not get another meal before bedtime. As he leaned back and looked up at the sky, something caught his eye. Just a few feet away, near the edge of the path, an elderly white woman sat in a wheelchair. She looked frail, her shoulders hunched and her eyes distant. A box filled with what looked like personal belongings had tipped over beside her. Books, a photo frame, and a folded blanket were scattered across the walkway. Her face looked tired, pale, and worn by something heavier than just time. Deshaun paused. No one else seemed to notice. Runners passed by with headphones in. A man nearby kept scrolling on his phone. 2 women walked past, whispering to each other without glancing her way. He stood, brushed the crumbs from his lap, and walked toward her. His hands shook a little, not from fear, but from hunger and the weight of the moment. He stopped a foot away, eyes soft. "Are you hungry?" he asked quietly, holding out half of his pizza. The woman looked up, startled. Her hands trembled slightly as she blinked back at him. The pizza glistened in the light, steam still rising faintly from its surface. "You're giving this to me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Deshaun nodded. She stared at him for a moment longer, then reached out with slow fingers. She took the slice, her hand brushing his just briefly. For a second, nothing else in the park moved. Just a boy, giving what little he had, and a woman, receiving more than food. Where are you watching from? When was the last time you gave without expecting anything back? The park was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, sending little ripples through the branches above. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs blending with the quiet laughter of children playing near the swings. The scent of warm earth and freshly mowed grass drifted through the air. 10-year-old Deshaun sat on the edge of a bench, his legs dangling, one shoelace dragging against the ground. He wore a ripped polo shirt that was 2 sizes too big and a pair of dusty sneakers that had seen better days. In his hands he clutched a slice of pepperoni pizza, wrapped in a crumpled napkin. It was his favorite kind, and he had been saving it all afternoon, knowing he might not get another meal before bedtime. Deshaun had been living on the streets for weeks. His mother had passed away earlier that year, and there was no other family willing to take him in. He had bounced through shelters, but none of them felt safe or permanent. His backpack was his closet. A park bench had become his bed. A public restroom sink became his mirror, and library books his only escape. He survived on leftovers, loose change, and the quiet kindness of strangers who sometimes looked twice and offered a sandwich or half a bottle of water. Every day was uncertain. Every night was a gamble. But despite the hunger, the cold, and the loneliness, he never stopped being kind. Mama always said, "If you still got a smile, you still got something to give," he often repeated to himself, especially on the hard days. His smile became a shield. It helped him face rude glances, turned backs, and the endless ache in his belly. It was not about pretending everything was fine. It was about holding on to the part of himself that still believed in goodness, even when it was hard to find. As he leaned back and looked up at the sky, something caught his eye. Just a few feet away, near the edge of the path, an elderly white woman sat, in a wheelchair. She looked frail, her shoulders hunched and her eyes distant. A box filled with what looked like personal belongings had tipped over beside her. Books, a photo frame, and a folded blanket were scattered across the walkway. Her face looked tired, pale, and worn by something heavier than just time. Few people recognized her, but Deshawn had heard her name once before from a nearby shopkeeper. Her name was Margaret Langford. Most people in the area only knew her as a quiet older woman who sometimes appeared in the park, always alone. What they did not know was that she had once been the matriarch of a massive real estate empire. She had built neighborhoods, advised politicians, and signed deals that shaped the city. Time and loss had pushed her into solitude. Her family thought she was fragile now. Her children stopped visiting. Her staff thinned out, but her mind, her power, and her heart, still very much intact. Deshawn paused. No one else seemed to notice. Runners passed by with headphones in. A man nearby kept scrolling on his phone. Two women walked past, whispering to each other without glancing her way. Have you ever had to survive more than people knew? Share your strength story. Just as Deshawn reached Margaret Langford and held out the pizza, a police officer walking nearby turned sharply toward them. His eyes narrowed, and his hand moved quickly to his belt. "Hey, step away from the lady," the officer barked. Margaret tried to speak, her voice strained and alarmed. "He is helping me." The officer ignored her completely. He stepped between them and grabbed Deshawn by the arm with force. The boy stumbled slightly, shocked by the sudden aggression. "You are harassing a senior citizen," the officer said, his tone sharp and unyielding. Deshawn's voice cracked. "No, sir. I was just giving her food." His hands were still open. The other half of his pizza slice remained visible. The entire moment had unraveled in seconds, from kindness to chaos. Without warning, the officer raised a metal baton and struck Deshawn across the back of his head. There was no time to react, no room to plead. Deshawn collapsed. The park went silent. A child near the swings stopped mid-laugh. A runner froze mid-step. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Margaret let out a cry. "You hurt him!" He was only helping. People began to gather, unsure of what had just unfolded. One woman clutched her chest. A man pulled out his phone and started recording. Another bystander knelt down beside Deshawn, whose small frame lay motionless on the concrete. The officer, now breathing heavily, looked around and saw the growing crowd. He seemed to hesitate, but did not apologize. He simply stepped back, eyes darting between the phone cameras and the child on the ground. Margaret shouted again, louder this time. "Someone call an ambulance! He needs help!" Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice in plain sight? Tell us what you saw. Margaret screamed, her voice piercing the still air of the park. Stop! You monster! The officer flinched at her words, but the damage had been done. Deshawn lay on the ground, blood pooling slowly on the cracked sidewalk beneath his head. The slice of pizza rested beside him, untouched, stained with dust. Several bystanders had already started recording with their phones. A teenage boy moved closer, his camera steady. A woman in a floral dress dropped to her knees and dialed for an ambulance, her hands trembling. Margaret wheeled herself forward, faster than anyone thought she could move. Her thin fingers reached for Deshawn's, gripping his hand tightly. Tears streamed down her face. "You hurt a child," she cried, looking up at the officer. "A starving child who shared with me." The officer froze. Something in her voice, or perhaps the authority with which she spoke, caused a shift. He looked again at the woman in the wheelchair, at the perfectly tailored scarf around her neck, the clarity in her eyes. And then he recognized her. His shoulders stiffened. "Ma'am, I did not realize." "Of course you did not," Margaret snapped. "Because you were not looking. You saw what you wanted to see, a black boy near a white woman, and you attacked." The crowd thickened. People murmured, watching closely. Some shook their heads, others kept filming. A few began asking for the officer's name and badge number. Margaret turned to the woman on the phone. "Tell them to hurry. He is barely breathing." Deshawn's small chest rose and fell, weak and shallow. His eyes fluttered but did not open. Margaret squeezed his hand again. "You are not alone," she whispered to him. "You are not alone." A few feet away, the officer's radio crackled, but he did not reach for it. His mouth opened slightly, as if to explain, but the moment for words had passed. Margaret was already giving her name to a second officer who had just arrived. "Margaret Langford," she said firmly. "I am the one he helped. I am the one who watched your officer strike him. I will testify. I will not be silent." The new officer nodded and guided her gently aside so the paramedics could reach Deshawn. They moved quickly, checking his pulse, placing a neck brace, lifting him onto a stretcher. Margaret followed them until they loaded him into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, she placed a hand on the edge of the gurney and whispered again, "You did nothing wrong. Nothing." The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Margaret remained behind, surrounded by silence and strangers. Her voice had shaken the park, but what mattered now was what would follow. If someone powerful stood up for you in a time of pain, who was it? Deshawn was rushed to the hospital with a concussion, his body bruised and fragile. The sirens wailed above the traffic, parting the city's busy streets with urgency. Margaret sat inside the ambulance, her hand clutched tightly to the rail beside his stretcher. Her eyes never left his face. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest and whispered gentle words he could not hear. Inside the emergency room, doctors moved swiftly. Nurses adjusted machines, checked his vitals, and cleaned the blood from his scalp. Margaret answered every question clearly, offering her name, phone number, and a full statement of what she witnessed. She did not leave the hospital. Not for water, not for food. Not even when her own back began to ache from hours in the waiting room chair. By nightfall, word had spread. Local reporters had caught the video. By the time Margaret stepped outside for a breath of air, camera crews were already gathered by the hospital's entrance. They asked questions, some gently, some fast and loud. One reporter held a microphone toward her and said, "Ma'am, is it true that this boy was helping you when the officer attacked him?" Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes, that child was hungry, but he offered me food. half of his only slice of pizza. He did not ask for anything in return. And that officer, he didn't see a child. He saw a threat, and that's the problem. The interview aired within the hour. That night, every major news station led with the story. The footage taken from the park showed Deshawn handing over the pizza, then being pulled away and struck. The audio captured Margaret's scream, the silence of the crowd, the sirens. Anchors repeated his name with disbelief. 10-year-old Deshawn Johnson, struck unconscious while offering kindness. Public outcry was immediate. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended within minutes. West justice for Deshawn, pizza and peace. Say his name. Celebrities retweeted the clip. Activists organized protests, and lawyers offered their services for free. People around the country demanded answers, demanded change. Outside the hospital, candles and signs began to appear. Children drew pictures and taped them to the wall. One showed Deshawn as a superhero holding a slice of pizza in one hand and a shield in the other. Another said simply, "We see you. We thank you." Inside the hospital, Deshawn slowly opened his eyes. The lights were too bright. His head throbbed, but he heard the soft voice beside him. "You are safe now," Margaret said, leaning closer. "The world knows who you are. They are listening." Deshawn blinked, confused. He did not understand the full scope of what had happened, but he knew he was not alone. Doctors came in to check on him. Nurses smiled gently. One of them whispered, "You're a brave boy. Everyone is talking about you." As the city stirred with outrage and calls for justice, the hospital room remained quiet. Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting on his. A boy who had once gone unnoticed had now moved a nation. Have you ever seen the truth finally come to light? Tell us how it felt. The city held its breath as officials released the body cam footage from the incident. The video confirmed what the public had already seen through phone recordings, but now there was no room for argument. The brutality was clear. The officer had approached with force, ignored Margaret's protests, and struck Deshawn without hesitation or provocation. Within hours, the police department issued a statement. The officer was placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. That same evening, under mounting public pressure and evidence that could not be denied, he was formally charged with excessive force and assault on a minor. The headlines continued to grow. Officer strikes 10-year-old in park incident. Justice for Deshawn. Investigation expands. The footage aired on every major network. Protests outside the courthouse turned into peaceful vigils and rallies for police reform. The community united in support. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, every eye on the front row where Deshawn sat quietly beside Margaret Langford. His head was still wrapped in a white bandage. His expression was calm, but his grip on Margaret's hand never loosened. Margaret was called to the stand. She wheeled herself forward with strength. She looked at the judge, then at the jury. "He saw my wheelchair and assumed I was helpless," she said clearly. "But Deshawn helped me. Not that man. The boy offered me food. The officer offered violence. I will not let the truth be buried under a uniform." The courtroom sat in absolute silence. The defense tried to argue that the officer misread the situation, that he had been under stress, that his actions were a mistake. But the footage, the testimonies, and the visible injury on Deshawn's head left little room for doubt. Witnesses from the park came forward. The woman who had called the ambulance, the man who recorded the video, even the child who had stopped swinging to watch. Each one confirmed the same story. Deshawn had done nothing wrong. On the third day of the trial, Deshaun was asked if he wanted to speak. He stood slowly, guided by the judge's invitation. He looked small in the large courtroom, his voice soft but firm. I did not think anyone would notice what happened to me. I just wanted to help someone. That is what my mom taught me. He paused, glancing at Margaret, but she noticed. She stood up for me. And now I am not afraid anymore. Margaret squeezed his hand. A tear rolled down her cheek. The courtroom again sat in stillness. Even the officer, seated at the defense table, looked down. Later that afternoon, the verdict came in. Guilty on all charges. Sentencing would follow. Margaret rolled up beside Deshaun and hugged him gently. Cameras flashed, but they did not speak to the reporters. They simply walked out of the courtroom hand in hand. Outside, cheers erupted. Flowers were handed to Margaret. Children waved signs. Someone played music softly from a speaker. It was a moment not just of justice, but of healing. Deshaun was still recovering, still processing all that had happened, but in that courtroom he had seen the truth stand firm. He had seen people rise to defend him. He had felt what it meant to be protected. Has someone ever stood by you when it mattered most? Tag them below. After the trial, the world continued to speak Deshaun's name, but it was Margaret Langford who had the final word. Just days after the verdict, she asked for a quiet meeting with Deshaun and his caseworker. They sat in a sunlit room overlooking her garden, one that had not been touched in years until Deshaun came into her life. Margaret took a deep breath and looked at the boy who had changed everything. "There is something I have not told you," she said. "I am not just grateful. I am wealthy, very wealthy." Deshaun looked up, confused. He had never asked for anything. He had never imagined what was coming next. Margaret continued. "I do not want to just thank you. I want to change your life. You deserve more than survival. You deserve a future." From a leather folder, she pulled out a stack of documents. She slid them across the table to Deshaun's caseworker and then looked him in the eye. "This is a trust fund in your name. It includes housing, education, medical care, and anything you might need for the future. And more than that, if you want, you can come live with me." The room went quiet. Deshaun blinked, unsure how to respond. The world had shifted beneath him once again. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Finally, his voice cracked. "But why?" Margaret smiled. "Because you gave when you had nothing. That makes you the richest boy I know, and that is the kind of wealth I want to build on." Tears filled his eyes. For the first time in months, Deshaun cried. Not from pain, not from fear, but from relief. From knowing that someone saw him, truly saw him. Not as a headline, not as a case, but as a child with a heart big enough to give away his only slice of pizza. Margaret leaned over and took his hand. "No one else has ever given me something so freely, expecting nothing in return. It reminded me of who I used to be. It gave me back something I thought I had lost." Deshaun whispered, "Okay." They hugged, a quiet, steady hug that needed no words. The next day, Margaret's lawyer made the arrangements official. Papers were signed, keys exchanged. Deshaun walked into a bedroom filled with books, fresh sheets, and a view of the same park where his story began. In the days that followed, Margaret arranged for private tutoring, counseling, and even a therapist to help Deshaun through the trauma. She did not rush him. She did not expect gratitude. She simply showed up every day to remind him that kindness should always be returned. As news broke of her gift, the public reacted with awe. But Margaret refused interviews. She said, "This was not a rescue. This was an answer." He already had everything that mattered. I just made room for it to grow. What act of kindness changed your life? We want to hear it. Weeks later, the air in the park felt different. The trees still swayed gently in the breeze. The children still played in the distance, and the sun still painted soft light through the branches. But something had changed. This time, Deshawn was not alone. He walked beside Margaret, who wheeled herself forward slowly but steadily. Her face was calm, proud, and open. They were side by side, just as they had been that day. But now the moment was theirs to write anew. They carried boxes of pizza between them, warm and steaming. Together, they made their way to the fountain at the center of the park. Around it, a small group of unhoused people had begun to gather, drawn by the scent and by the story that had traveled across the city. Deshawn opened the first box. "Here," he said, handing a slice to a man with tired eyes. "Still warm. Extra cheese." Margaret followed his lead. "And here is another. Take 2 if you are hungry." One by one they passed out slices. No cameras, no microphones. Just quiet dignity. Just people taking care of people. When the last box was opened and passed, Margaret turned to Deshawn. "You were the first person to treat me like a human," she said. "That day, I was invisible to everyone else, but not to you." Deshawn smiled, his eyes glistening. "That is what Mama would have wanted. She always said no one should feel forgotten." They sat beside the fountain, sharing their own slice of pizza, watching as the people they had helped laughed and talked. It was the same place where Deshawn had once been attacked, where he had bled and cried in silence. Now it held something else entirely. It held healing. The park had become a symbol, not just of pain, but of possibility, not just of injustice, but of restoration. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Deshawn. He opened it and read aloud. "Langford Foundation, Community Outreach Division, Co-Director Deshawn Johnson." He looked up at her, stunned. "You earned that title the moment you gave me your lunch," she said. "Now the world will follow your lead." He did not speak. He only nodded, slowly, knowing that every hard day had led to this one. Around them, the breeze moved again, softer than before. The past could not be erased, but it could be rewritten. What place holds deep emotional meaning for you? Share it with us. From pain came purpose. From prejudice came power. And from a single slice of pizza came a lifetime of change. Deshawn's story, once confined to a park bench and a single act of generosity, had now echoed far beyond his city. It had crossed borders, opened eyes, and touched hearts. He became more than a boy who survived. He became a voice for the unheard. In the months that followed, Deshawn began to speak at schools, libraries, and youth events. His message was never complicated. He told his truth. He spoke of kindness, of courage, and of the moment he chose to help instead of hide. Children lined up to shake his hand. Parents cried quietly in back rows. Teachers used his story in their classrooms. And police departments, once silent, began using Deshawn's case in their training programs. His name was written into curriculum. His image placed beside words like integrity and empathy. At each talk, Deshawn would pause and remind the room, sometimes a little kindness is louder than any siren. Margaret continued to support him not only as family, but as a partner in purpose. She launched a youth leadership fund in his name, dedicated to training young voices to stand for justice, compassion, and equity. Grants were given. Internships were created. And Deshawn helped choose the first round of recipients. Universities took notice. 3 offered him full scholarships. Each letter spoke of his impact, his strength, and his vision for a better future. Deshaun chose the one closest to home, where he could still visit the park when he needed to remember where it all began. He never stopped showing up. He still volunteered at shelters, still helped pass out food, still reminded people that no matter how little you have, there is always something to give. And Margaret, never far from his side, continued to remind reporters and crowds, "I am not his savior. He is mine." The park, once marked by blood and sirens, now held new memories. A plaque had been installed by the fountain. It read, "Here, a boy gave all he had and changed everything." From a broken world, Deshaun had shaped something whole. His voice became a thread that stitched people together. His kindness built bridges no policy could. His story was proof that healing does not require perfection. It only requires one person willing to act with love. If you believe love is stronger than hate, share this story. Let the world know what kindness can really do.